They laughed when I stepped onto the training floor. A small woman, quiet as a shadow for 3 long weeks, now standing across from a towering sergeant twice my weight. The whispers were sharp, the bets casual, as if the outcome had already been decided. Most figured I would collapse in less than 10 seconds. Yet before the dust could settle, before the echoes of their laughter had faded, that same man lay motionless on the ground. And in the stunned silence that followed, every eye in that room began to see me differently. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. And share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. These stories are not just mine, they belong to every veteran who has carried strength quietly. To every soul who has ever been underestimated, and to all who know the weight of silence before the storm. I was not the rookie they imagined, not even close, but in that moment, not a single person in that training bay knew the truth. I had kept to myself, enduring 3 weeks of smirks and careless words, choosing patience over protest. I listened, I observed, and I let them believe what they wanted to believe. What they could not see was that I carried a lesson, one forged in years of service and tested in fire. It was not meant only for them, but also for myself. And in the span of a heartbeat, that lesson shattered every assumption in the room. The Georgia sun was relentless, hanging heavy above the training compound like a punishing overseer. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, rising in waves that blurred the edges of the barracks and bleached the sky into something close to white. I had felt the desert sun of Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet this kind of southern heat carried its own cruelty. It was thick, smothering, with the scent of pine and dust mingling in the air. Even in the shade, sweat rolled down the backs of our necks, dampening the collars of our uniforms. The young soldiers cursed under their breath, but I stayed quiet. Silence was its own shield. I had walked into this program under a name that meant nothing to them. They saw a woman in her 40s, small-framed, carrying herself without bravado. No one knew the years that lay behind me, the convoys rattling across hostile roads, the long nights spent guarding prisoners. The sudden bursts of violence that tested every ounce of discipline I had. Here, stripped of rank and reputation, I was just another face in a sea of recruits. That was the point of the program. Anonymity was the test. From the first day, I felt their eyes on me. The young men carried themselves with the confidence of fresh muscle, their egos fueled by the belief that youth alone was armor. A few women were scattered among them, equally determined to prove their worth. I did not fault them for their ambition. What caught me was the way their gazes slid over me, quick assessments that landed like dismissive stamps. Too small, too quiet, not built for this, she will not last a week. In the evenings, when the heat lingered and tempers ran short, I would catch fragments of their talk. They gathered outside the barracks, laughing, trading stories, spinning reputations they had not yet earned. My name came up more than once, the woman who barely spoke. The one who lagged at the back, conserving her strength instead of rushing to be first. Some thought I was timid, others thought I was simply weak. They were young enough to confuse silence with surrender. I kept my face neutral when I heard them, but inside I felt the old ache of recognition. I had been underestimated before, written off in the early years of my career. I had stood in formations where men twice my size assumed they would carry me, only to learn that strength had little to do with bulk. I had carried that weight before, and here it returned, fresh and sharp, as if no years had passed. Perhaps that was the lesson I needed to relearn. The program instructors watched everything with sharp eyes, but they gave nothing away. We rose before dawn, ran until our lungs burned, drilled until sweat pooled in our boots. Georgia in August was merciless, and the compound seemed designed to strip us down to our barest selves. For most of the recruits, the struggle was new. For me, it was familiar. Pain had a rhythm I had long ago memorized. Fatigue was a language my body spoke fluently. The real challenge was not the work itself. It was holding back, because I knew I could not reveal myself too soon. That was the deal I had made when I stepped into this training. Keep quiet, blend in, endure the tests without calling on the history that set me apart. I was not here to relive my rank or my past. I was here to measure what remained of me after all those years. Was I still the woman who could keep her head when the bullets cracked too close? Could I still rely on instinct and discipline when stripped of recognition? These were the questions that pressed against my silence. At night, lying on the narrow bunk, I listened to the sounds of the barracks. The rustle of sheets, the snores, the whispers that drifted long after lights out. I stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster, thinking of my children now grown. Of the husband who had waded through deployments and carried his own scars of absence. Life had shifted while I was gone. Friends had moved on. My body carried its own reminders of service, small aches that lingered, scars no one else noticed. Yet here I was again, in the heart of discipline and routine, testing myself in ways few could understand. By the second week, the murmurs had turned into open bets. They wagered bottles of soda, packs of jerky, even extra laundry duty on how long I would last. One young private, not more than 20, claimed I would break before the end of the week. Another shook his head and gave me until the end of the month. They laughed when I passed by, not cruelly, but with the careless amusement of those who believed the game was already decided. I let them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let others underestimate you until the truth is ready to surface. There were moments when I wanted to correct them, to remind them that appearances deceive, that the smallest frame can carry the greatest weight. But I held my tongue. Words would have been wasted. In the army, talk was cheap. Action was the only currency that mattered, and when the moment came, I intended to spend it all. The days crawled forward in the heat, drills bled into each other, the cadence of boots against gravel, the bark of orders, the rasp of exhausted breath. I stayed at the edge of things, not to hide, but to watch. Observation was its own form of power. I noticed the way the tall private's knee buckled slightly during runs. I noticed the sergeant's habit of favoring his right side during demonstrations. I cataloged weaknesses, not for cruelty, but for readiness. Old habits die hard. The weight of their eyes pressed on me, but I had learned long ago that eyes cannot break you unless you let them. Every stare, every smirk, every whispered bet became another stone I carried in silence. I stacked them carefully, building a wall inside myself not to shut the world out, but to remind myself that patience has its own strength. And as the third week began, whispers spread of a test to come. A demonstration fight. Volunteers were called, but names were also chosen. When I heard mine, a flicker passed through the room. Some grinned openly, already imagining the spectacle. They thought they knew how it would end. They had no idea. Stay with me to see what happened next. The silence would not last much longer, and when it broke, the lesson would belong to all of us. The morning the announcement came, the air was heavier than usual, thick with the kind of damp heat that clung to your skin and made even breathing feel like labor. We had been roused before dawn, shuffled out into the yard where the flag hung limp against a sky that promised no mercy. Sergeant Morrison's voice carried over the formation, steady and sharp, the way a blade sounds when it slides free of its sheath. There would be a demonstration at the end of the week. Not a drill. Not a lecture, but a fight. He said it with the same finality one might use to announce a verdict. The younger recruits perked up, their eyes alive with the hunger for spectacle. They wanted a show, something to break the monotony of running and drilling, something to give them stories to tell later. I knew the type. They longed for proof of their own toughness, even if they had to borrow it from watching others blade. The air buzzed with anticipation, and in that buzz my name rose again. It started in whispers, then in chuckles, until it echoed openly. They were certain I would be the chosen sacrifice. I kept my face still, though inside my chest something shifted. It was not fear. I had faced fear before, and this was not it. It was the weight of inevitability, the knowledge that the moment I had been waiting for was finally closing in. The silence I had carried would not stretch much longer. Soon, action would speak in the only language that mattered here. Over the next days, the talk grew louder. In the mess hall, I heard my name paired with odds as if I were a horse at the track. Some said I would be knocked flat in seconds. Others said I might manage a minute before giving in. They wagered snacks, cleaning duties, even bragging rights. I ate my meals quietly, tasting little of the food, listening instead to the sound of their certainty. It had a sharp edge, like glass waiting to cut. At night, the barracks hummed with speculation. Some recruits leaned over bunks, spinning stories about how spectacular my failure would be. A few voices questioned whether I might surprise them, but those were drowned out by laughter. They wanted to believe I was weak. It made them feel stronger. There is a certain comfort in measuring yourself against someone you have already decided is beneath you. I let them keep their comfort. It would make the break sharper when it came. In those long nights, I thought of my first deployment. I had been young then, not much older than many of the recruits around me now. My uniform was crisp, my boots unscuffed, my heart caught between pride and dread. Back then, too, I had felt the sting of dismissal. I was small, female, and quiet in a field where loudness was mistaken for competence. The first time I rode in a convoy, one of the older sergeants had muttered that I was dead weight. I remembered gripping the edge of my seat, the rifle steady in my lap, and promising myself I would prove him wrong not with words but with survival. Years later, I had. And yet here I was again, living the same dismissal in a different uniform. The cycle never really ended. The heat did not relent. Sweat stung our eyes as we drilled, our boots sinking into dirt that gave way under relentless pounding. My body ached in familiar ways, muscles tugging against scar tissue, lungs burning with the reminder that age was no longer a stranger. But beneath it all, I felt the quiet coil of strength that comes only from endurance. I had lasted before, I would last again. One afternoon, as we lined up for combatives practice, Private Jenkins grinned at me, his teeth flashing against skin darkened by sun. He was young, cocky, with the kind of easy charm that made others laugh at his jokes even when they were not funny. He leaned closer, his voice low enough for those around us to hear. "You ready for the big show?" "Ma'am, hope you've got insurance. That mat is rough when you hit it." The others chuckled. I met his eyes and said nothing. Silence can be its own kind of reply, and mine unsettled him enough that he looked away first. Still, the laughter followed me as we moved onto the mats. Every throw, every grapple, every lock was performed under the press of their expectations. They waited for me to falter, to prove them right, when I did not. They convinced themselves the real test had not yet come. Sergeant Morrison called my name at the end of the session. His eyes, sharper than the rest, held no amusement. He studied me the way a craftsman studies a tool, weighing not appearance but potential. His voice was flat when he told me I would be in the demonstration. No surprise, no ceremony, just the confirmation of what we had all already known. The room rippled with excitement. The bets were sealed. The stage was set. That night, lying awake while the barracks whispered, I thought of what was to come. I thought of the man I would face, a seasoned instructor known for his brute strength. I pictured the way he moved, the way he carried his weight. My mind mapped out possibilities, rehearsing not in detail but in instinct. The body remembers what the mind cannot always name. The hours of training, the years of practice, the countless times I had thrown men larger than myself, all of it lived in my muscles. I trusted that memory more than anything else. Still, a sliver of doubt crept in. Time changes us. Age creeps in, subtle but undeniable. Would my body answer the call as it once had? Would my hands be steady, my reflexes sharp, or would the years betray me at the worst possible moment? Doubt is a quiet voice, but it can roar in the silence of night. I let it speak, then I reminded myself of the truth. Courage is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to move forward in spite of it. The day before the fight, the compound seemed to hum with expectation. Even the instructors carried themselves differently, their eyes flicking toward me with something like curiosity. I had become the center of a story they were all writing in their heads. Some expected tragedy, others expected comedy, few expected revelation. I would let them write their versions because soon the real story would take its place. In the mess hall, as I sat with my tray, Private Jenkins walked past and smirked. "Hope you've got your will in order, Captain Quiet." He thought the nickname clever, though it was not. A few around him laughed. I lifted my fork, took another bite, and offered him nothing in return. Sometimes silence is louder than words. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and red, I stood alone outside the barracks. The cicadas sang, their voices rising in a chorus that filled the air like static. I closed my eyes and breathed. Tomorrow. Everything would change. Tomorrow, the silence would end. And when it did, it would not be my voice that shattered their certainty. It would be the sound of truth hitting the mat. Stay with me. The fight had not yet begun, but the lesson was already forming. In the weight of their eyes, I carried both their doubt and my own resolve. Tomorrow, one of those weights would fall away forever. 3 weeks is not a long time in the rhythm of a life, but inside the compound it stretched like an eternity. The days bled into each other, measured only by the rising of the flag at dawn and the fall of lights at night. The heat pressed against us like a second skin, and every morning began with sweat before the first drill even started. In that world, silence became my anchor. It was not born of fear, though the younger recruits thought it was. It was discipline. It was memory. It was survival. The instructors had made it clear from the beginning. Those of us in the reintegration program were to keep a low profile. Rank and history meant nothing here. We were stripped of titles, given the same plain uniforms, folded into formations as if we had never held authority. It was a way of evening the field, of reminding us that the army is larger than any single soldier. But for me, silence was not only a rule, it was also a choice. A chance to test what was left of me when words were taken away. The first week was the hardest, not because of the drills, though they were grueling, but because of the weight of judgment. The young soldiers had sharp eyes, always measuring, always comparing. They wanted to know who was strong and who was weak, and silence gave them an easy answer. Weak, invisible, easy to dismiss. I could see it in their smirks, in the way their conversations shifted when I passed by. They did not hide it. They did not think they had to. I reminded myself of the roads of Iraq, convoys that stretched for miles across open desert, each vehicle a target waiting to be lit. The silence of those rides had been suffocating, the air thick with dust, engines growling beneath our feet, radios crackling with half words. We would sit for hours without speaking, eyes scanning horizons that seemed empty until they were not. Silence then was not weakness, it was readiness. It was the space where instincts sharpened. Every sound mattered. A distant thud could mean nothing or everything. A flash on the horizon could be heat or a trigger. That silence saved lives. I thought of one night when our convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. The world erupted in fire and sound, but what I remember most is the silence inside me. The stillness that settled as training took over. My voice was steady over the radio, calling out positions, marking movements. My hands did not shake, even as rounds cut through the air around us. In that chaos, silence was the calm that kept us alive. I carried that memory with me into these weeks. When the recruits mocked my quiet, I almost wanted to laugh. They had no idea what silence could hold. The second week was easier in its own way. My body adapted to the rhythm, muscles settling into the grind of early mornings and endless drills. The whispers around me grew bolder. They called me Captain Quiet when they thought I could not hear. They bet on the day I would give up. They rolled their eyes when I kept to myself during breaks. I let them. Sometimes letting others underestimate you is the sharpest blade you can carry. They were building their own lesson, and I would not take it from them too soon. At night, when exhaustion pressed against my bones, I let my mind drift back to Afghanistan. The mountains there were unforgiving, their silence deeper than any desert. I remembered escorting supply lines through narrow passes, where every bend felt like the mouth of a trap. We would move slowly, eyes scanning ridges, rifles ready. The silence was so heavy it seemed to hum, a vibration that pressed against the chest. Every soldier felt it, some cracked under it, some filled it with nervous talk. I learned to lean into it, to let it wrap around me until I could hear what others missed. A shift in gravel, a click too sharp to be stone. The breath of danger before it showed its teeth. That silence had weight. And in its weight there was power. The third week brought the rumors of the demonstration fight. My silence became the centerpiece of their jokes. They mistook patience for passivity. They mistook stillness for surrender. What they did not know was that I was listening. Every word they spoke, every detail they revealed about themselves, I stored away. Silence is not empty. It is observation. It is the discipline of seeing what others overlook. By the time those 3 weeks had ended, I knew more about my fellow recruits than they knew about themselves. One night, lying in the dark, I thought of the prisoners I had guarded as a military police captain, men who shouted threats one moment and begged for mercy the next. Some used silence as a weapon, refusing to speak, trying to rattle us. I had learned then that silence is never neutral. It is always saying something. It can be defiance, it can be endurance, it can be the mark of someone biding their time. 3 weeks in this compound proved the same. My silence spoke volumes, even if they could not hear it yet. The days were long, the heat unrelenting, but the hardest part of those 3 weeks was not the sweat or the stares. It was the memory that crept in when the world went quiet. Faces of soldiers I had served with, some alive, some not. The way silence lingered after the blast of an IED hanging heavy over the wreckage. The quiet of folded flags handed to grieving families. Those silences never left you. They lived inside, rising again when the present slowed long enough to let them through. I carried those silences with me too. They were part of why I stayed quiet now. Words could not always hold what memory carried, so I endured 3 weeks of laughter at my expense, 3 weeks of whispers that grew bold enough to echo, 3 weeks of heat and dust and sweat, and still I stayed silent, because I knew something they did not. Silence is not the absence of strength. It is the preparation for it. And when the moment came, that strength would speak louder than any word I could have spoken. The silence is almost over, but the lesson it carries has only just begun. By the time the third week reached its end, I could feel the silence pressing against me like armor. Heavy, yes, but protective. It had become a rhythm, a way of breathing. Some recruits filled the empty space with chatter. They swapped stories about high school football, about girlfriends back home, about the lives they wanted to build once their time in uniform was over. I listened without joining. Their voices became part of the background. And my quiet became part of the story they told about me, the woman who said nothing, the one who walked like a ghost among them. They laughed at it, but in truth, they feared it a little too. People always do when faced with silence they cannot explain. Silence taught me patience. It taught me to hold back when every instinct begged me to push forward. There were mornings when my legs burned during runs and I wanted to sprint past the cocky privates who kept taunting me. There were moments on the mats when I wanted to pin someone quickly, just to prove that their words had no weight, but I stayed still, because I knew that breaking my silence too soon would rob the lesson of its power. They had to write their own version of me first. They had to believe it fully. Only then would the truth cut as deep as it needed to. Every night. Barracks turned restless. By then my silence had become entertainment. They speculated not only about how quickly I would lose the fight, but also about why I stayed quiet. Some said I was afraid to speak because I did not want them to hear the tremble in my voice. Others joked that I was plotting, like some kind of spy dropped into their midst. They laughed at that one, though none of them believed it. For them, I was not mysterious. I was just small, just weak. That was the story they needed. But stories have a way of collapsing when faced with truth. The silence pulled me back into memory again. Afghanistan, summer of my 4th deployment. We had been running convoys through valleys where ambushes were frequent. One evening, as we stopped to check a damaged vehicle, the world grew strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your skin and makes every hair stand up. It was in that silence that I noticed the unnatural stillness of the ridgeline. The birds had gone silent. The air felt wrong. I called it in, told the men to take cover, and moments later fire rained down from the ridge. We survived because silence had spoken first. Had I ignored it, we would have walked straight into the kill zone. That night taught me that silence is never empty. It always has something to say if you know how to listen. Here in Georgia, silence said something else. It reminded me of how easy it is to underestimate. I remembered the way Afghan villagers used to watch us, their eyes hooded, their expressions unreadable. Some soldiers dismissed them as harmless, but I learned not to dismiss anyone. A boy carrying water might be carrying something else. A woman with her eyes cast down might still be calculating. Appearances deceive. The lesson was written into every deployment. Now, 3 weeks into this program, I could see that lesson preparing to repeat itself. There were moments when I wanted to break, when the laughter grew loud enough to cut, when the whispers circled me like flies. Silence is not easy. It is a test of endurance, a measure of how much you are willing to carry without relief. But I had carried worse. I had carried grief. I had carried loss. Silence was heavy, yes, but it did not break me. It forged me. By the 3rd week, the instructors began watching me more closely. I caught Morrison's gaze more than once, his expression unreadable. He knew what the others did not. Maybe not the full weight of my history, but enough to suspect that my silence was not weakness. He never said it aloud. He let the story play out as instructors often do. Sometimes the harshest lesson is the one you let others walk into unprepared. The night before the demonstration was announced, I lay awake again, staring at the cracked ceiling. My body ached in familiar ways, muscles singing the tune of exhaustion. But my mind was alive, sharp, remembering every deployment, every night ride, every watch on the tower when the desert stretched endless and black. Silence had been my companion then too. It had been the reminder that the world can change in an instant, one heartbeat quiet, the next torn apart. Silence taught me to respect every breath, every moment of calm, because calm never lasted. In those memories, I found my center. I remembered holding the hands of soldiers after firefights, their eyes wide, their words broken. Sometimes silence was all I could give them. The quiet presence of another human being who understood without demanding words. Those moments stayed with me more than the gunfire. They shaped me. They made me believe that strength is not always in action. Sometimes it is in the stillness that holds everything together when chaos breaks loose. 3 weeks of silence in Georgia may have looked like nothing to those recruits, but to me it was another battlefield, a test of patience, of restraint, of carrying the weight of judgment without letting it bend me. I knew the fight was coming, I knew the moment was close, and I knew that when silence finally broke, it would do so in a way they could never forget. On the last night of the 3rd week, I stood again outside the barracks. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing like electricity. The compound glowed under weak floodlights, and the smell of cut grass mixed with dust. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, steady and slow. Tomorrow the whispers would end. Tomorrow silence would give way to proof. I felt no fear, only readiness. I turned back toward the barracks and slipped inside, the voices of the younger soldiers rising and falling around me. They did not look at me, they did not see me. That would change soon enough. For now, I lay down on the narrow bunk, folded my hands across my chest, and let the silence carry me into sleep one last time. Stay with me. The silence is about to break, and when it does, the sound will echo far beyond the walls of that training bay. The announcement came just after dawn, when the air was still heavy with the damp heat of Georgia mornings. We had finished our run and were gathered in formation, sweat rolling down our necks as the instructors paced before us. Their boots struck the ground in rhythm, each sound sharp against the silence of the field. When Sergeant Morrison's voice broke the air, it carried the weight of command. He told us there would be a demonstration that afternoon. A fight. One of us against one of them. My name followed, spoken with precision, and the crowd of recruits rippled with excitement. Whispers swelled into laughter. It was the moment they had been waiting for. Sergeant Miller would be my opponent. Even before his name was spoken, I knew it would be him. He was built like the stories young recruits told themselves about invincible soldiers. Broad shoulders, arms that looked carved from stone. A presence that filled the training hall before he even stepped inside. He had a reputation for toughness that bordered on cruelty, a man who believed discipline came only through domination. He was the perfect choice for what the recruits thought this demonstration would be. To them it would be a spectacle, the small woman finally crushed by the force of a real soldier. Their laughter told me as much. I said nothing, of course. I kept my eyes forward, my face still, but inside. I felt the shift. The 3 weeks of silence had been the prelude. Now came the reckoning. The moment when patience would no longer be the point but the weapon. I did not fear Miller. I respected the power he carried, but I knew power is not always strength. Strength is in control, in precision, in knowing when to strike and when to hold. I had spent years learning that lesson. He, for all his size, had yet to see it tested against someone who refused to yield. That afternoon, the training hall buzzed like a hive. The recruits filled the bleachers, their voices rising and falling in waves. Some shouted bets across the rows, their confidence in Miller absolute. A few wore skeptical looks, the beginnings of doubt planted but not yet grown. The instructors lined the edges, arms folded, their expressions unreadable. They had seen fights like this before, though not with me at the center. The mat in the middle gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The space where stories would be broken and rewritten. I walked to the edge of the mat in silence, every step measured. The recruits' voices grew louder, their laughter sharper. They wanted to see me fall. They had built their own story of who I was, and this fight was the climax they had been waiting for. I let them have it for one more moment. Miller entered next, his boots heavy against the floor, his presence drawing cheers. He stood tall, chest out, his smirk aimed directly at me. To the recruits, he was invincible. To me, he was simply another opponent. When I stepped onto the mat, I felt the familiar calm settle in. The kind of calm that had carried me through ambushes, through firefights, through nights when the world held its breath. My body remembered before my mind had to remind it. My stance shifted, weight balanced, eyes steady. I was not here to prove anything to them. I was here because silence demands its own conclusion, and this was it. Miller rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck with exaggerated flair. He wanted the recruits to see confidence, to see dominance before the fight even began. He barked something under his breath, a comment about how quick this would be. I did not answer. Words were his weapon. Silence was mine. When the instructor gave the signal, the room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on us, every sound stilled. In that heartbeat before the first move, I could hear my own pulse steady, calm, unshaken. The fight had not yet begun, but already the lesson had. It was in the air. In the tension that wrapped itself around the room, in the way expectation pressed down on every shoulder. They thought they knew the story. They thought they had seen the ending. What they did not understand was that endings are rarely what they seem. And in less than a minute, they would learn just how quickly a story can change. The instructor's hand dropped. The room seemed to inhale as one. Miller advanced the way a storm cloud rolls in, heavy and certain, his boots barely grazing the mat as if gravity itself bent to his size. He wanted the fight to last long enough to humiliate me, but not long enough for anyone to question the outcome. His smirk deepened when I did not move, when I simply watched him approach. To him, my stillness confirmed what he already believed. To me, it was the only way forward. Stillness is not surrender. It is preparation. He lunged, aiming to grab my shoulder and pull me off balance. The mat shuddered beneath his weight. Time did not slow, but my mind sharpened, each detail crisp and exact. The angle of his arm, the shift in his hip, the overconfidence in his stride. I had seen that same stride in Afghanistan, in men who thought their size alone was weapon enough. They had all learned otherwise. Miller was about to join them. I pivoted on my left foot, my body moving in rhythm with his momentum. My hand caught his wrist, guiding his weight past me. The recruits shouted, their voices rising with excitement. They thought he had me. They thought I was about to be crushed under his size. But size is nothing against leverage. His force became my weapon. In the space of a breath, I turned, dropped my hips, and locked his arm in a joint hold. His body jerked. His balance broken, the mat rushing up to meet him. The sound of his fall cracked through the hall like a rifle shot. Gasps filled the silence that followed. 12 seconds, that was all it took. 3 weeks of silence answered in less than half a minute. The man they believed unbeatable lay pinned beneath me, his face twisted not in pain but in disbelief. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the room shrank until it was only the two of us. He saw it then. What the recruits could not yet name: control, precision, discipline sharper than muscle. I released him when the instructor called the end. Miller rolled onto his side, rubbing his shoulder, pride bruised deeper than flesh. He did not look at me again. The recruits did not cheer. They did not laugh. The silence that filled the hall was heavier than any noise they could have made. Silence had returned, but this time it belonged to me. I stood slowly, my body steady, my breath calm. Around me, the recruits stared as if seeing me for the first time. Their smirks were gone, their bets forgotten. Some looked ashamed, others looked awed. A few simply looked uncertain, their world tilted by what they had witnessed. They had come expecting humiliation. They had found revelation instead. In 12 seconds, the story they had written about me collapsed, and in its place stood something they could not yet define. The instructors said nothing. Their silence was different, measured, knowing. They had expected this, perhaps even planned it. They understood what the recruits did not. That sometimes the greatest lesson comes not from words or lectures, but from the breaking of assumptions. This was not about me defeating Miller. It was about showing them that strength is not always where you expect it to be. That silence does not mean weakness. That stillness can be the sharpest weapon of all. I stepped off the mat, each footfall deliberate. The recruits parted without a word, the path opening before me. Respect is not always given. Sometimes it must be taken, but I had not taken anything. I had only revealed what had been there all along. They saw me now, not as the quiet woman in the corner, but as a soldier who carried something they could not measure. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Later, when the hall had emptied and the evening air cooled the sweat on my skin, I sat alone outside the barracks. The cicadas sang their endless song, and the sky stretched wide above me. I thought of the silence that had carried me here. The silence of convoys in hostile valleys, the silence of nights when danger crouched unseen, the silence of folded flags handed to trembling hands. All those silences had shaped me, had carved away the noise until only discipline remained. Today, in 12 seconds, that discipline spoke louder than any voice I could have raised. The recruits would talk about it for weeks. Some would try to explain it away, calling it luck or trickery. Others would carry the memory as a lesson, a reminder not to underestimate what they did not understand. For me, it was not about the fight. It was about the silence that had led to it, the stillness that had made it possible. Silence had been my shield. Discipline had been my blade. Together, they had written the truth on the mat for everyone to see. 12 seconds, that was all it took. But those seconds carried the weight of years, of battles fought and endured, of lessons learned in dust and fire. And in those seconds, every whisper, every smirk, every dismissal collapsed into nothing. The silence that followed was the sound of respect being born. There is more to tell, because fights do not end when the mat clears. They ripple outward, changing everything in their path. But that moment, those 12 seconds, will always remain the first turning point. The moment silence broke. The moment I reminded myself and everyone watching that strength is never about the noise you make. It is about the discipline you carry. And discipline speaks louder than anything else. The fight ended, but its echoes carried far beyond the mat. That evening, the training compound hummed with a strange kind of quiet. The recruits who had once jeered at me now avoided my eyes, their conversations clipped, uncertain. I had become something they did not know how to name. No longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but not yet understood. They whispered in corners, trying to piece together what they had seen. Some called it luck, others admitted it was skill. None could make sense of the silence that had carried me to that moment, and I did not correct them, not yet. The instructors gathered us the next morning in the open field, the sun climbing heavy in the Georgia sky. We stood in formation, rows of sweat-stained uniforms, the smell of dust and grass thick in the air. Morrison walked the line with a look I had not seen before, not suspicion, not doubt, something sharper, recognition maybe, when he stopped in front of me. His voice carried enough weight for everyone to hear. "Captain Torres," he said. The title hung there, heavier than the humidity, heavier than the silence that followed. For weeks I had been Private Torres, a ghost folded into the ranks. In that instant, the mask fell. The recruits' eyes widened, heads snapped toward me, their disbelief painted across their faces. Morrison did not smile, but there was a shift in his tone, a respect that had not been there before. Military police. He continued, 8 deployments, former combatives instructor. You've been listening to one of the quietest voices in this compound, but also one of the sharpest. Consider this your lesson. The field was still, as if even the wind had paused. I kept my stance steady, but inside I felt the weight of the reveal. Not shame, not pride, but the inevitability of truth finally spoken. I had carried silence long enough. Now it was time for the recruits to see beyond the surface they had mocked. They shifted uneasily, some looking at me with awe, others with guilt, all of them with new eyes. The woman they had dismissed as fragile was no longer a mystery. She was a soldier who had walked the same dust, carried the same burdens, and survived more than they had yet imagined. Morrison's words cut deeper than any reprimand could have. "You've all been measuring strength in volume," he told them. His gaze sweeping the line, in size, in how loud you can laugh or how fast you can boast, but strength does not live in noise. Sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is wait, be patient, let the action speak when it matters. His voice lowered, but the quiet carried even stronger. Yesterday, action spoke. I suggest you all remember it. The formation ended, but the air around me had changed. The recruits who had once crowded together in their laughter now parted when I walked by, not out of avoidance, but out of recognition. A few offered nods, tentative but real. One or two muttered words of respect, quick and awkward. They did not yet know how to bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I had become in their eyes. That bridge would take time, but it had begun. Later in the mess hall, I felt the weight of their glances. The room that once rang with jeers was now filled with silence of a different kind. A silence that carried apology, that carried curiosity. Some wanted to ask questions, to understand. Others could not yet find their voices. I did not seek to ease their discomfort. Growth comes from discomfort, and they needed to sit with what they had seen. Still, when one young private approached me, his tray shaking in his hands, I met his eyes and gave a small nod. He sat beside me in silence. Sometimes presence is enough. That night, Morrison called me into his office. The walls were lined with certificates, photographs of past classes, the echoes of soldiers who had come before. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, studying me with a look I had seen in the field, the look of a man weighing not just skill but character. "You held the line well," he said. His voice was steady but not cold. I doubted you at first, thought you were hiding, thought maybe you didn't have the fight in you anymore, but I see now you were waiting. I held his gaze, my own voice calm. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is wait. Sometimes patience is the only way to cut through the noise. He nodded, a small smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. You taught them something yesterday, maybe taught me something too. His hand tapped the desk, a rhythm of thought. You reminded us that silence is not weakness, it's preparation. And when preparation meets action, there's no mistaking strength. I left his office with the night air cool against my skin. The cicadas still humming in the distance. The compound was quiet, but not the uneasy quiet of before. This silence carried something else: respect, recognition, a shift that could not be undone. The mask had fallen, and in its place stood truth. But truth is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of what comes after. Reveals in the military world rarely come with applause. They arrive in silence, in sideways glances, in the subtle shift of how others carry themselves around you. That was how the days unfolded after Morrison spoke my name aloud. The recruits no longer laughed when I walked into the mess hall. Their eyes followed me, not with mockery, but with the awkward respect of people who have been forced to rewrite their story of someone in an instant. Respect, I knew, is not born in a single moment. It is forged in repetition, in showing up day after day until disbelief has no ground left to stand on. I understood that. I had lived that truth in war zones where trust was as scarce as clean water. The first to bridge the silence was a young private named Harris. He was tall, lean, quick with his words, and had been among the loudest in mocking me before the demonstration. On the third day after the fight, I found him lingering at the edge of the training mats, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. When I asked what he needed, his voice cracked in a way that surprised us both. I can't get the throws right, he admitted. His tone carried none of the arrogance I had once heard in it, only frustration. I studied him for a moment before nodding. Show me, I said. He moved, clumsy and stiff, his size betraying him. The others watched from a distance, pretending not to but unable to look away. I stepped closer, placed my hand against his elbow, shifted his stance. Stop fighting your own weight, I told him. Strength isn't about forcing. It's about using what's already there. Let his momentum be your weapon. He tried again. This time his partner hit the mat with a thud that made Harris's eyes widen. For the first time since I had met him, he smiled, not the smug grin of a boy showing off, but the quiet relief of someone realizing he was capable of more than he believed. That moment mattered more than any takedown I had made. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, a few others sought me out between drills. Not openly, not yet, but in the small stolen minutes when the instructors looked the other way. They asked about footwork, about balance, about how to stay calm when nerves threatened to undo them. I answered simply. No long speeches, no lectures. Just small corrections, reminders to breathe, to focus, to let patience steady the body before movement. And slowly, their eyes changed. I was no longer the ghost of 3 weeks past. I was something else now, someone they trusted to guide them. One evening, after lights out, I sat on the steps outside the barracks, the Georgia night pressing humid against my skin. The cicadas sang their endless song, and the air smelled of earth and dust. A few recruits lingered nearby, whispering about home, about fears they hadn't spoken before. One of them, a young woman named Diaz, turned to me. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. How did you stay silent that long? She asked. I couldn't do it. I'd have snapped the first week. I thought of the convoys in Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, the endless hours when silence was the only shield between life and death. I thought of folded flags and graveside quiet that spoke louder than any eulogy. My chest tightened, but I kept my tone steady. Silence isn't about holding back, I said. It's about listening, about waiting until the right moment comes. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is be patient and let action speak. They nodded, their young faces reflecting something deeper than understanding. They felt it, the truth of it, not because I had said the words, but because they had seen those words come alive on the mat. That is the thing about lessons in the military. Words mean little unless they are tied to action. Action is the language we understand best. In the following days, the instructors adjusted their tone with me as well. Morrison no longer studied me with suspicion. He gave me space to guide the others, subtle nods of approval when he caught me teaching quietly at the edges of the drills. Once, after a long day, he walked past me and said under his breath, "You're making them better." That was all, but in those 4 words I heard everything I needed. He no longer saw me as a test case, a silent question. He saw me as a leader again. It was strange in a way. I had come into this program stripped of rank, stripped of title, meant to be just another soldier in uniform, and for weeks I had been invisible. But the moment my silence broke, the truth of who I was could no longer be contained. The mask was gone, and what stood beneath it was not weakness, but the strength of years lived in discipline and in patience. Still, I did not forget what those 3 weeks had taught me. Silence is never wasted. It carves space for observation, and for resilience, for the kind of strength that does not shout but endures. And now, with the recruits looking to me not as an opponent but as a guide, I realized the silence had done its work. It had prepared them to hear what I had to say. On the final night of that week, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon with fire, I gathered a few of them near the training field. They waited quietly, the laughter and chatter of days past replaced with stillness. I looked at each of them, their faces shadowed but eager. My voice carried steady, low. The way I had spoken to soldiers in war zones when the night pressed heavy against our hearts. Strength isn't always loud, I told them. It isn't always big. Sometimes it is patient, sometimes it waits, and when the moment comes, action will always speak louder than any word you could say. The field grew quiet around us. Even the cicadas seemed to pause, and in that silence I felt it, the shift that cannot be forced. The moment when soldiers stop seeing you as one of many and start seeing you as someone who carries something worth remembering. The mask had fallen, the lesson had landed, and the story of who I was in their eyes had been rewritten for good. The weeks after the fight unfolded differently. The compound no longer buzzed with cruel laughter when I passed. Instead, the air carried something quieter, heavier. Respect does not arrive overnight, but the first tendrils had rooted themselves into the hearts of the recruits. I could feel it in their footsteps, in the way their voices softened when I approached. The jeers had become silence, and slowly that silence turned into acknowledgement. It began with Harris. He was the one who had first asked me for help on the mats, the one who had once been the loudest in mocking me. One afternoon, after drills, he came to me again. His face was tight with a kind of shame young men rarely let themselves wear. He cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." The word ma'am hung in the air, clumsy but sincere. "I thought you were nothing. I thought you didn't belong here. I was wrong." His eyes did not quite meet mine, but his voice held steady. I nodded, accepting his words without the need to humiliate him with forgiveness. Growth is fragile. Sometimes a simple nod is all it takes to keep it alive. Others followed, not in speeches, not in dramatic confessions, but in small gestures. A tray slid across the mess hall table, set beside mine without hesitation. A hand offered to steady me as we carried gear, though I did not need it. A whispered word of thanks after I corrected a stance or showed a grip. These were not apologies in the way civilians imagine them. These were soldiers' apologies, carried not in words but in actions, and I accepted each one with quiet grace. But I also reflected, often at night when the compound slept and the cicadas hummed their steady song. My silence had not been about proving I was stronger, smarter, or more capable. It had not been about humiliating those who mocked me. No, it had been about something deeper, a reminder, for them, yes, but also for me. Because the enemy we fight most fiercely in this world is not always the one across the mat or behind a rifle. Sometimes it is the enemy inside us, the enemy of assumption, of prejudice, of believing we can measure another's worth by size, by volume, by appearance. That enemy is subtle, but it can be deadly. I thought of the convoys again, of the nights in Iraq when we trusted the wrong face, and the cost was blood on the sand. I thought of Afghanistan, of allies who proved false because someone judged them too quickly or too slowly. I thought of the faces of the young soldiers I had buried, their lives cut short because someone underestimated what danger looked like. Prejudice blinds us. It makes us lazy. It convinces us we already know the story before it has been told. That was why I had stayed silent. That was why I had waited, not to show I was better, but to show them what danger assumptions could be. One night, Morrison joined me outside the barracks. He leaned against the railing, the glow of his cigarette painting his face in shadow. He exhaled smoke into the humid air and said quietly, "They'll remember this for a long time." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen many lessons fail to land, many warnings go unheard. They'll tell the story of the 12 seconds, not because it was fast, but because it was true. I did not answer at first. I watched the stars overhead, their faint light barely breaking the southern night. Finally, I said, "If they remember anything, I hope it's not me. I hope it's the silence before. That was the real fight." He studied me, then nodded once. We both knew the truth. The silence was what had shaped the outcome, not the takedown itself. As the days slipped into weeks, the recruits began to grow in ways that made me proud. They moved with more patience, less bravado. Their eyes carried more weight, less arrogance. Some of them still faltered, of course. Youth does not transform overnight, but they carried themselves differently, as if the 12-second fight had carved something into them that no lecture could, and perhaps it had. I carried it too, not as a trophy, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of why I had come. I had not stepped into that compound to reclaim rank or to prove myself. I had come to strip myself bare, to see if I still had the discipline that war had carved into me. To remind myself that silence is not weakness, but the deepest kind of strength, and I had found my answer. The lesson was not only for them, it was for me as well, and in that shared lesson, something shifted. We were no longer recruits and veteran, no longer mocker and target. We were simply soldiers bound by the same truth. That was enough, but I could not know then how far the story would travel. How the 12-second fight would echo beyond the walls of the training bay, whispered in other compounds, retold in barracks I would never see. The story would grow, as stories always do, until it became something larger than myself. But in those first quiet days after, all that mattered was the silence broken and the truth revealed. Time has a way of softening the edges of memory, but some moments refuse to fade. Years after I left that training compound, I would still hear about the fight. At first, it came in fragments through old comrades who passed along stories they had overheard in other units. "They're talking about you down at Benning," one friend told me. Some recruits called it the 12-second fight. I laughed when I heard that, not because the story was wrong, but because it had become theirs now, something beyond me. Soldiers carry stories the way they carry scars. They share them not for entertainment, but because lessons live longer when they are wrapped in narrative. The story traveled, reshaped with each telling. In some versions, I took down a man twice my size with a single strike. In others, the silence I held for weeks grew into months. Exaggeration was inevitable. The truth mattered less than the lesson it carried, and the lesson endured. Do not underestimate, do not assume, do not mistake silence for weakness. Those truths became sharper each time the story left a soldier's lips. I retired quietly, the way I had lived much of my career. No fanfare, no parade. Just the folding of a uniform, the handing over of a badge, the silence of stepping away from a life that had defined me for decades. Yet even in retirement, the Army's echoes followed me. At gatherings of veterans, I would sometimes catch the whisper of my own story spoken by people who did not know I was standing beside them. You ever hear about the captain who dropped a sergeant in 12 seconds flat? Someone would say, heads would nod, laughter, respect, disbelief. I never corrected them. The story no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the soldiers who needed it. Years later, I returned to a training base as a guest speaker. I was older then, my hair streaked with gray. My hands stiff from years of wear. The recruits lined up in formation, their faces so young it made my chest ache. Morrison was gone by then, but his words lingered in the air. The commandant introduced me as Captain Torres, retired. There was polite applause, respectful but restrained. They had no idea yet why I was there. I told them the story, but not the way they had heard it whispered in barracks. I told them the truth about the 3 weeks of silence, about the jeers and the doubt, about the fight that lasted 12 seconds but carried the weight of years. I did not tell it to glorify myself. I told it to remind them of the enemy that lies within assumption. I told it so they might carry the lesson forward. The room was quiet when I finished, not with disbelief but with understanding. That was all I needed. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She was small, her uniform hanging loose on her frame, her eyes sharp but weary. She said, "They all think I'm too small, too weak. They don't take me seriously." Her voice wavered, but her gaze did not. I placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Let them underestimate you. Patience will be your ally. When the time comes, let your actions speak." She nodded, her lips pressed into a line of determination. In her face, I saw myself again, younger, untested, dismissed, and I felt something settle in me. Legacy is not about medals or titles. It is about passing strength into hands that are still learning how to hold it. The story of the 12-second fight did not make me a legend. It made me a vessel, a reminder carried from one generation to the next. Sometimes when I walk through veteran halls, I hear the whispers, the quiet captain, the woman who waited. Those words carry more weight to me than any ribbon pinned to my chest because they are not about victory. They are about patience. They are about discipline. They are about the truth that silence, when carried with purpose, is stronger than any roar. In the end, the lesson was never mine alone. It belonged to every soldier who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. It belonged to every woman told she was too small, every man told he was not strong enough, every soul who has carried doubt like a weight across their shoulders. It belonged to those who found within themselves the patience to wait, the discipline to endure, and the courage to let their actions speak when the time came. That is the legacy of the 12-second fight, not the speed, not the shock, but the silence that came before and the respect that followed after. And if that story continues to be told long after I am gone, then it will have done what every soldier hopes for. It will have left the world stronger than it found it. When I look back now, after all the years, what stays with me is not the 12 seconds on the training floor, but the silence before and the respect that followed. That moment was never about proving I was stronger than a man twice my size. It was about reminding myself and anyone watching that strength does not always look the way you expect. I have carried that truth into every season of my life, on the battlefield. Survival rarely came from the loudest voice or the biggest frame. It came from steady breathing under fire, from calm hands at the wheel of a convoy, from discipline when fear begged you to run. In the end, it was patience, skill, and loyalty that pulled us through. Muscles tire, pride falters, but the quiet core inside, the one that refuses to break, that is what endures. So when people tell the story of the fight, I hope they hear more than the shock of a takedown. I hope they hear the message that no one should ever be dismissed because of their size, their gender, or the way they carry themselves. We never know the battles someone has fought before we meet them. We never know what fire has forged their steel. Through my years in uniform, I learned that the quiet ones are often the strongest. They are the soldiers who change the course of a mission, the leaders who steady a room when panic threatens, the friends who stand firm when everything else is falling apart. Their power is not in shouting or showing off. It is in holding steady until the right moment and then letting action speak with undeniable clarity. If there is anything I want to leave with you, it is this. Do not measure people by what you see on the surface. Look deeper. Respect the ones who wait, who listen, who prepare. Because sometimes the most unassuming soul is the one who carries the strength to change everything. That is the legacy of my 12 seconds, and it is the lesson I hope you carry long after this story fades. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And true strength has never been about the noise we make, but about the discipline we keep. If this story spoke to you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of courage, grit, and military resilience. And let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from. It is always inspiring to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us as one community.